Paul, good? Everybody's good? All right. Heads up, everybody.
Recording in progress.
Ça marche.
Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Kristina Michaud, porte-parole du Bloc québécois en matière de changement climatique. Je suis accompagnée de Mme Elisabeth May, députée du Parti vert, et de Mme Alex Fergus, directrice des politiques nationales chez Réseau Action Climat. Et on joint nos voix aujourd'hui pour mettre de la pression sur le gouvernement qui s'apprête à aller à la COP28. Nous serons d'ailleurs à la COP28 également. Et c'est un exercice transpartisan qu'on peut appeler aujourd'hui, que je suis bien heureuse de faire. Je disais à des collègues qu'à Québec, c'est une coutume plutôt courante de voir les partis d'opposition se rallier ensemble avec des organisations pour demander des comptes au gouvernement. On voit ça moins souvent au fédéral, alors je suis très contente de m'affilier avec ces deux personnes aujourd'hui pour demander des comptes au gouvernement. On sait que le gouvernement se dirige à la COP28 un peu avec les mains vides, avec un bilan qui est pas rose du tout. Le Canada n'a jamais réussi à atteindre ses cibles de réduction des gaz à effet de serre. C'est ce que le commissaire à l'environnement, Jerry DiMarco, nous a confirmé encore une fois il y a quelques semaines, que si ça continue comme ça, on n'atteindra pas les cibles pour 2030. Alors, il y a un coup de barre vraiment à donner dans le secteur gazier pétrolier, notamment. Et ce que le commissaire nous disait, il y a des retards dans les politiques qui doivent être mises en place, qui sont au cœur de l'action climatique. Et dans ces politiques-là, on parle du plafonnement des émissions du secteur gazier pétrolier. Ça fait longtemps qu'on attend une grille, un cadre réglementaire par rapport au plafonnement des émissions de la part du gouvernement. Alors, c'est un peu ce qu'on vient demander aujourd'hui ensemble au gouvernement pour qu'il arrive à la COP28 avec ce plan, ce cadre réglementaire du plafonnement des émissions. On sait que le secteur gazier pétrolier a un certain passe-droit au Canada. C'est l'un des secteurs les plus polluants. Et malgré ça, il peut continuer de polluer parce que les réglementations ne sont pas suffisamment sévères. Alors, on demande au gouvernement d'aller de l'avant avec une réglementation qui est sévère et ça doit être fait rapidement. Alors, il y a aussi le rapport de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie qui est sorti aujourd'hui, qui montre que les 800 milliards de dollars américains qui sont investis chaque année dans le secteur gazier pétrolier devra être coupé de moitié si on veut atteindre nos objectifs internationaux. C'est 60% des émissions qu'on devra réduire également qui proviennent du secteur pétrolier gazier. Je suis certaine que mes collègues vont vous en dire davantage là-dessus et je vais d'ailleurs laisser la parole à Mme May.
Merci beaucoup, Kristina. J'ai hâte de travailler avec vous à COP28. Oui, je suis toujours, ce n'est pas un plaisir, évidemment, de parler encore avec le défi de changement climatique, l'urgence climatique et les besoins de mon gouvernement, notre gouvernement de Canada. We now have a new International Energy Agency report that makes it very, very clear what we've known for decades. To hold to a livable degree of climate change, we must cut emissions from the oil and gas sector. We must work to end our dependence on fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But certainly, according to the IEA, we have to cut by at least 60% from the oil and gas sector by 2030. The recent report that my colleague from the Bloc Québécois just mentioned of our Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, Jerry DiMarco, made it very clear that it's the oil and gas sector and its increase in emissions in Canada that has been the single largest reason for our failure as a nation to do our fair part in reaching climate targets. The oil and gas sector in Canada has increased its emissions by 88% since 1990. When we talk about, as the IEA does, trying to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, that is the goal of the Paris Agreement. The various nationally determined contributions, such as Canada's 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, is an inadequate commitment to play our fair share of what we agreed to do in the international binding agreement, the Paris Agreement, to ensure that we hold to as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible, and to hold, if possible, to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase. Ce n'est pas un niveau de réchauffement de terre sécuritaire à 1,5 degrés Celsius, mais c'est notre dernier espoir pour atteindre un niveau de changement climatique où était possible d'imaginer une société à l'avenir avec une civilisation et une économie durable. We have one chance as the window on 1.5 degrees is closing, and that one chance is that our government must go to COP28 not with empty hands, as Kristina just said, but prepared to announce hard caps and a plan to move to reduce the emissions from the oil and gas sector. And with that, I turn the microphone over to Alex Cool-Fergus of the Climate Action Network.
Hi, everyone. My mistake for going after two such wonderful speakers. So I'm speaking to you on behalf of Climate Action Network Canada. We are a network of more than 150 faith unions, labor unions, youth groups, First Nations, and local grassroots organizations from coast to coast to coast. CANARAC stands in solidarity with the Bloc Québécois, with the Green Party, as well as with the NDP and certain members of the Liberal caucus who have been pushing for a strong and ambitious emissions cap to be released before, the framework to be released before COP28 in a couple of days. I mean, I will not expand more on the science, which could not be clearer that the oil and gas emissions have to go down across Canada and as well as across the world if we want to see a livable future for ourselves, for our children, and for our grandchildren. But, en fait, je vais le dire en français, au-delà de la science, la population d'une partie à l'autre du pays souhaite voir ce plafonnement des émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur pétrolier et gazier. Au Québec, on sait que c'est près de 9 Québécois sur 10 qui sont en faveur d'un plafonnement ambitieux. 2/3 of the population of BC, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and the Atlantic regions also want to see an ambitious target. And even in Alberta, it's close to 6, or it's more than 6 out of 10 people who want to see a cap, with that support rising to more than 75% if we're speaking to youth. The regulation can be a win-win-win for people, but to do so, we need the government to get on it and to release the framework as soon as possible. Now, the IEA report that came out today showed that pretty clearly the issue of fossil fuels and their rising emissions are going to be central at COP28 in Dubai. And what's more, in the midst of an affordability crisis, these corporations within Canada as well as within the world have raked in record-breaking profits while simultaneously cutting jobs and investments in clean energy alternatives. We think that the government has a responsibility to act, and that is why the framework has to get out into the open. There was only the first step in the regulatory process. It's already taken much too long. The stakes are high, and climate change is not waiting. Every single delay and rollback of climate policy in Canada means more forest fires, more floods, more freak storms, and more deadly heat waves. There's no time to lose. Now, I'm confident that our country can meet the momentous challenges ahead, but that requires an all-hands-on-deck approach. The emissions cap is a huge piece of the puzzle, and that's why we are calling on the Prime Minister, the federal cabinet, and the government to get on with it and release the framework before COP. Thank you.
Je ne suis pas certain, mais nous sommes disponibles pour les questions en anglais ou en français.
The Bloc, the Greens, and also CANRAC. What's the cap that you would like to see? You know, how much megatons would you like to see the oil and gas sector reduce their emissions by?
So what we're asking the government to do for this framework is essentially just get it out as soon as possible so that we can have those kinds of conversations out in the open. We recognize that it is a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge to reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector, but what we're asking the government to do is align with what science is telling us we need to do. If you look at Canada's ERP targets, the country as a whole has to reduce our emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. We are asking the government to, at a minimum, align with that objective for the oil and gas sector, and we're asking them to go beyond that, given the outsized emissions of the oil and gas sector within Canada.
On behalf of the Green Party, we're looking at this, yes, in terms of percentages and cuts, and we have to comply with the advice of the International Energy Agency and meet our own nationally determined contribution. We also think it's time for the government of Canada and the Liberals to stop speaking out of both sides of their mouth. You can't simultaneously say we can expand oil and gas production in Canada and somehow meet our emissions targets, as though it's not our fault if we produce oil and bitumen and produce it and send it to other countries and they burn it there. I've heard the Minister of Environment on the floor of the House say, well, it's burned in another country, so it doesn't count against our emissions. We have to actually bite the bullet. We have to face the fact that as an oil-producing country, we can't keep producing more oil, drill off Bay du Nord, produce more bitumen out of the oil sands, and still think that we can magically convert that to fewer emissions. We have to stop the hypocrisy and the fraud that putting billions of dollars into carbon capture and storage is a climate solution. We have to, and I know that people find it hard to believe that we can still stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but it's not built yet. It's not finished yet. And if and when it is finished, it will produce a pressure to expand production in the oil sands for the most carbon intensive of the various oil products available for Canadian producers. And with every threat of finishing the pipeline comes, of course, a massive increase in the number of oil tankers off our coasts, and not just a possibility of a massive oil spill that can't be cleaned up because it's diluted bitumen, but a certainty of it. So there are things we can do that make a lot of sense. We can absolutely insist that the cap for oil and gas producers be consistent with the target that the Trudeau government put in place in spring of 2022, Earth Day 2022. They put in place a range, 40 to 45%. If you look at Environment Canada documents, you'll find they've conveniently dropped off the 45%. Almost everybody says, 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, and we're not on track for that. But one of the things that stands in the way of our being on track is not just the percentage numbers and the lack of a framework, it's the failure to address the problem, the elephant in the room of cognitive dissonance. You can't keep expanding oil and gas production and think you're going to bring down emissions. So cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline, accept the fact that we're going to have to produce less oil and gas in Canada, use more oil and gas from Canada in Canada, stop importing from other countries. There's a long list of things we can do in the transition. And we want to also emphasize that the International Energy Agency is calling for countries and oil and gas producers to massively increase their own investments in renewable energy so that we can move quite quickly away from our dependence on fossil fuels.
Mais écoutez, Madame May très bien a mis le doigt sur le problème. C'est un peu la même chose au Bloc québécois. On va même un peu plus loin en disant c'est pas seulement le plafonnement des émissions dont on a besoin, c'est le plafonnement de la production. On peut pas continuer à vouloir aller de l'avant avec de nouveaux projets d'exploitation pétrolière et gazière. Et on voit le gouvernement le faire, malheureusement, avec des projets d'exploration au large de Terre-Neuve dans des zones marines protégées. Alors, c'est certain que si on a des objectifs de réduction des gaz à effet de serre, même si plusieurs secteurs de l'économie font un effort, si le secteur gazier et pétrolier ne le fait pas, bien, on n'arrivera jamais à nos cibles. Alors, c'est un peu dans le même sens qu'on va. Faut arrêter d'aller de l'avant avec de nouveaux projets. Et c'est même ce que le secrétaire général des Nations unies dit depuis plusieurs mois. Il faut arrêter d'aller de l'avant. Alors, quand on a des rapports devant nous, comme celui de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie qui dit il faut vraiment couper, ça nous démontre que le Canada a une responsabilité qui est énorme.
No one is willing to say what the target of the 2030 cap should be, but we are hearing from the Pathways Alliance, a group that represents the largest oil sands producers, and what they are calling for is a reduction, they said a cap of like 22 megatons below whatever the level is in 2030 is what they can comply with. Do you think that that is sufficient for the cap in 2030?
No, it's not sufficient. The only thing that is sufficient is that which is necessary, and what is necessary is dictated by the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that we have to ensure that in order to hold on to 1.5 degrees, or even to stay as far below 2 degrees as possible, we need far more dramatic cuts before 2030. And that's not about the politics and deciding how much can you greenwash the oil and gas sector. It's about a reality of a carbon budget, and the atmosphere and laws of physics and chemistry aren't mutable. They're not interested in negotiating with the Alberta oil sands sector. There's a carbon budget in front of us. We have one opportunity to hold on to a livable world for our kids, and that choice is now. The window for making those changes is in a matter of a few years. Even talking about cuts by 2030 is too late. The IPCC report of April 4th, 2023 made it very clear that in order to hold to 1.5 or 2, we needed to ensure that global emissions of fossil fuels peaked and began to fall rapidly at the latest by 2025. So we need to move much more quickly, and we need to express clearly what the science requires of us, not what the oil and gas industry is prepared to accept while they talk about their primary duty to shovel profits to shareholders.
Can I answer that one as well? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, obviously the Pathways Alliance and their members would prefer that there be a status quo. Because they benefit off of that, and they stand to gain from that. And we are not expecting that government policy should be dictated by industry associations. That is just not how it should work in Canada. We wouldn't expect the tobacco industry to let government know how much tobacco should be allowed to be sold in stores, and we shouldn't be expecting oil producers to tell us to what extent their emissions can be reduced.
So Canada does not agree with the 22 megatons reduction by 2030. So what's the number that you would see would be more in line?
I mean, listen, I would encourage you to ask that question to the people who are making the decisions on it. As I said, we are hoping that the government's going to align with science. It is not our job to tell the government exactly what the number should be, but we are hoping that it, at a minimum, is in line with Canada's overall NDC, and at and hopefully, ideally, aligns with what the IEA is saying, which is that it has to be emissions from that sector have to be reduced by 60% between now and 2030 in order for us to maintain a livable world.
All right, for the people joining us online, this is just a reminder. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Hi there, Mark Ramsey with the Toronto Star. It's a bit of an unrelated question, but still has to do with kind of general topic. So as Canada rapidly transitions to a green economy, there's increased investment in the clean energy sector, and we saw that in the fall economic statement. However, jobs in that sector are dominated by men. Are you concerned that this transition is leaving women behind? And what do you think the government needs to do to address that? Thank you. And this question is for any of you.
Well, thank you, Mark. The climate crisis disproportionately impacts women. So when we look through a gender lens at the climate crisis, we're looking far more at the emergency created by ignoring the need to make a transition. I think the word transition, is increasingly an anachronism from a time decades ago when one could imagine an orderly transition away from fossil fuels. We're now in a time of disruption. New technologies advance rapidly, and there are many women employed in a number of the alternative energy areas, but primarily moving away from fossil fuels will, on a gender lens, benefit women who are otherwise victimized by increased climate instability. And I can't tell you how many families I've talked to who experienced multiple evacuations within the last year due to the climate crisis. That disproportionately affects women trying to hold families together, trying to get kids back into school after being pulled out of their communities because of fires or floods. We need to address that the climate crisis disproportionately is a threat to women and the jobs and the opportunities that exist on the other side of that. Yes, we need to fight for women's place in that new zero carbon, decarbonized economy. I'm less worried about that than what happens to women if we fail.
So, Mark, do you have a follow-up?
I would answer that question as well. Just no, it's okay. Just with the caveat that I'm not the expert in the clean energy economy, and I'm happy to bring you to people who are. But one of the major pieces of the clean energy sector is that it has to be done in place, and it can be done in a very local way. Whereas the oil and gas extraction really only happens in certain parts of the country, and so we're importing workers from the Atlantic area, from otherwise disadvantaged communities, and we're bringing them to places where they can have these jobs. The clean energy transition and clean energy development projects are much more local. They're much more close to home, and I think that actually would play a major role in not only women's interest in joining into that transition and that economy, but also in maintaining families. It's hard when a member of your family has to fly across the country every couple of weeks and to go work in the oil sands. So we very much see the energy transition as a woman-friendlier option, but of course there is always much more to be done to attract women into trades, and of course we stand very, very, very closely interested in that topic.
I would add one thing. This is sorry. Just in terms of women in the solar energy, I don't have statistics on this, Mark, so it's anecdotal. But I had a profound experience meeting in St. John's, Newfoundland, with a Newfoundlander, a woman who had worked on the oil platforms off Hibernia and was so much happier that she was now installing solar panels on roofs in St. John's and in its suburbs. And then her experience of how much she enjoyed that work resonated when I was talking to a Victoria, BC area solar panel contractor who said he has now the majority of his workforce are women because he finds they both enjoy the work and are very, very productive workers and enjoy what they're doing, work fast, and he finds them very reliable employees for installing roofing solar panels. So it's not empirical, it's anecdotal, so I hesitated to add it, but thank you. By the way, the woman I was talking to in St. John's, Newfoundland was a local representative for the organization Iron and Earth. So if you looked up Iron and Earth Atlantic Canada, you might be able to find this fantastic woman whose name has escaped me, and I'm sorry for that. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.